forward to hearing from you all a little bit later on.
So there's been a lot of Q&A about our partnership, and some people we found out were confused about the extent of whether we were business partners or more than that. So I will let you know she's my fiance as of 2 weeks ago. Very new. We slept on the journey as boyfriend and girlfriend. We're coming home as fiance. That's exciting.
That's a good sign, considering a lot of people were like, we're gonna have a lot of time together in the car.
Yeah, we grew closer, not further apart. So where the inspiration of this journey came about, I think the best way to actually sum it up is by reading an excerpt from my journal, which was written about a year ago, just over a year ago. So this was Citizens Climate Lobby was just mentioned a second ago, and that's really where this project grew from. It was a conference I was at about a year ago. It's the annual International Citizens Climate Lobby Conference. It's held in DC in June every year. I was at that conference a year and a half ago, and I was basically very inspired. And I'll read you what I had written the day of after the first day of that conference. What an inspirational last day this has been. Much needed clarity. I came to DC prepared to tell Mark, my Citizens Climate Lobby chapter leader, that I just cannot lead the Newport Climate Resolution team. I'm just too overwhelmed with work. Walking to the conference, preparing to talk to Mark, then it hit me, what am I doing? Climate change is the issue of our time, perhaps for the species, and I'm too busy? This is what I've always wanted to do and work on, and I'm too busy with work and other projects. Suddenly the distortion of my priorities shine like a light. This is my calling. This is important and what I must prioritize. What better reason to pursue your passion than the world literally depends on these types of pursuits. The other things can wait. I'm going to complete my remaining 1 year of postdoctoral research and then take a year to work with CCL, publish op-eds, do climate outreach, and travel to climate-afflicted regions. Blog about it, write about it, maybe I'll pump out a book. Talk about that later, but that actually ended up happening, which is exciting. I want to give myself completely to this important cause. My PhD was never to allow me to live comfortably within the walls of academia. It was meant to give me a voice for advocacy. And 11 years later, I've earned that voice, yet I'm locked up in my office, heading down a confused path meant for someone else. This trip has let me remember my purpose, remember my calling. Being surrounded by 1,300 climate advocates has been truly inspiring. I'll be lobbying Dana Rohrabacher on Capitol Hill on Tuesday, and that's exactly what I need to be doing. So that's what I wrote the day that this trip came about in my head. I called Athena, and so basically I had come to that conference prepared to sort of, put this outreach, climate outreach, on the side as I could work, and I instead got inspired and had a total 180 of my perspective. I called Athena, in fact, that day, and I said, hey, what do you think about when you finish your master's and I finish my postdoc, taking a year just to do climate outreach? We'll work more with CCL and other groups, and just work on getting the message of climate change out to the public, trying to galvanize and mobilize people towards climate solutions. And that didn't start an argument, actually. She was right on board from the get-go. And yeah, it's now a year later, and we're 7-8 weeks into the Road for Climate Action. And it's really just the beginning, although the Road for Action is only about a 3-month journey. We're already seeing its potential to grow into something else. And maybe we even do a Pacific Northwest tour if we feel like this was worthwhile, which we are feeling it to be. So thank you all for coming. I'm happy you could be a part of the Road for Climate Action and that I could be here today. Getting started, I always talk about what influences the climate to kick off the presentation. I know a lot of people in this crowd are already familiar with climate science, but there's some sort of foundational things that I think are kind of obligatory at the start of any climate presentation. These are a few slides that will go over that. There's a few graphs, but it's really not a graph-heavy presentation, so bear with me. I actually met with Congressman Dana Rohrabacher again today, interestingly, with Athena. So I read you that excerpt, and today was our second meeting, my second time meeting him in person in his office in DC. And I actually had a conversation about what I'm about to present to you, which is what he told me is, climate change is natural. I told him, I agree with you. The first part of my presentation, everywhere I'm going, I state the same thing. Climate change is natural. So let's look at the natural drivers of climate change and distinguish why today is a little bit different than the past and why we should be concerned. So these are the natural drivers of Earth's paleoclimate, of how temperatures have gone up and down in the past. It is largely due to what's collectively called the Milankovitch cycles. How many people are familiar with the Milankovitch cycles? Show of hands. Okay, a few of you. So this is a worthwhile slide. Basically, Earth orbits the sun, which Copernicus told us a long time ago. And it also sits on a tilt, 23.5 degrees. And it also wobbles, much like a top that you spin on the table. These sort of motions all actually, they're not just in motion, but they actually change. So for instance, the shape of the orbit around the sun isn't a fixed ellipse. It actually fluctuates from more elliptical to more circular and back again. But it doesn't do that every decade. It does it every 100,000 years. It completes one cycle. Yes, it's important for influencing temperatures on Earth, but all of these are tens of thousands of year timescale cycles. They don't act overnight. They don't act over a few decades. In short, they fail to explain the sharp increase in temperatures that we've seen over the last couple centuries, and more increasingly so over the last few decades. What about solar cycles? We often hear about this too, talking about climate change. Well, solar cycles are also, they do influence the climate. Very, very small, I might say, small influence, but they do influence the climate. What do I mean by solar cycles? The radiation from the sun isn't fixed in terms of its intensity. It also fluctuates from more sunlight, less sunlight in it. It's a very small difference, but it does fluctuate, but it does so every decade or so. So these are very short, frequent cycles. In this case, they're actually too frequent to explain this gradual trend decade after decade of warming that we've been seeing. These are going up and down every 10 years. It's not explaining what we're seeing. So let's go to another natural influencer of the climate. How many people are familiar with the greenhouse effect? All right, it's a little bit more well known. Same greenhouse that operates in the botanical gardens is what we've got here on Earth. But instead of the glass trapping the heat, we've got an atmosphere, more specifically greenhouse gases, which are essentially serving as the same function of this glass. They're letting sunlight in, but they're not letting that low frequency light back out after sort of the plants and the soil warm up. They also radiate energy back outward. But that glass won't let that escape, neither will these greenhouse gases. It's not entirely true. Some of that energy does escape, which is why it's actually better to think of the greenhouse, our greenhouse, is more like a botanical greenhouse with windows in it. What we're doing by releasing more methane, more CO2, more of these potent greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is we're effectively rolling up the windows of that greenhouse. What would you expect if you rolled up the windows of the greenhouse? Just like your car, temperatures would go up. So that's what we're seeing. It's really not surprising that this would occur. CO2 levels have been going up rapidly with time. Dr. Charles David Keeling showed with direct measurements, a postdoctoral research project actually, which turned into his life's work, was measuring CO2 in the atmosphere. And he showed that basically year after year after year, CO2 was going up and up and up. Basically sounded the alarm that we had an impending climate crisis. CO2 levels were going up and up and up. If you look at ice core data, so you drill into these locked away parts of glaciers that have been essentially isolated from our upper atmosphere for a long time, and you look at the CO2 bubbles that have been trapped in those ice cores, you can actually measure CO2 from the past. And when we look at those measurements, we see that CO2 didn't start rising right around Dr. Keeling's measurements, but actually started rising quite sharply around this period, which coincides with the Industrial Revolution. More coal, more oil starting to burn, and now, of course, in the modern day, we've got cars and things like that. So what we would expect as we've been sort of digging on the Earth's surface and tapping into carbon reservoirs that have been essentially isolated for millions of years, burning them, injecting that carbon into the air in the form of carbon dioxide, we would expect CO2 levels to go up, and that's what explains this trend here. Really, it's no mystery to science, and scientists aren't debating any of this. Makes perfect sense. The last graph I'll show you here is a very important sort of foundational graph to understand the current climate predicament. We've got CO2 and temperature on this graph, going back 400,000 years in time. So for one thing, this shows just what I was saying, which is climate change isn't new in the sense that temperatures have gone up and down in Earth's past. We've got to acknowledge that if we're going to have a real conversation about climate change. But there's a couple important takeaways from this graph. One is that we see regularity. Well, actually, let me say first, temperature and CO2 are tightly coupled. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. We see that over this entire 400,000 year period. That's actually exactly what we would expect given the heat-trapping nature of carbon dioxide, but it's nonetheless reinforcing to see it here in the data. The second thing to note from this graph is that there's some regularity here. About every 100,000 years, we see a new peak in temperature and CO2. So there's a regular pattern, and this happens to coincide with those natural drivers of temperatures on Earth, those Milankovitch cycles, which operate on tens of thousands of year timescales. So we see regularity here, and when we get to the modern period, this is when we started to really burn a lot of coal and oil. It was right here when CO2 levels were at about 280 parts per million. Throughout Earth's history, last 500,000 years, they've been fluctuating from about 180 to 280 and back again. So around the Industrial Revolution, we're at 280 ppm, and we start to see that level go up as we sort of burn a lot of coal and oil. But what's happened since 1950 is really what's got Athena and I on the road for climate action, and a lot of other scientists and others very concerned and alarmed about our future. That is current CO2 levels, which are now up here. So in just about a 70-year period, we've really accelerated our extraction of coal, oil, natural gas. We've really been injecting more and more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. We're way above these 100,000-year peaks. We're not even way above the average. We're way above these 100,000-year peaks. We're above by about 45% or so. So this is really quite concerning. It doesn't take a statistician to look at this graph and see that we've got an anomaly here, an anomaly that is something that we can explain and something that we should probably get a hold of. What will happen to temperature? So we're already starting to see this play out. Temperatures have been going up and up and up in recent years. And in the last, 10 hottest years globally are presented here. 9 of those 10 have occurred since the year 2000. So what about 2017, 15, 16? Much, much higher. So we saw sort of a really sharp increase in just the last several years or so. If we pan out further, we can see that temperatures actually started to go up quite a ways back. Ever since we've been taking direct measurements from the late 1800s, but around this period it started to really take a sharp increase up as we've been, again, extracting more coal, oil, natural gas, burning more fossil fuels, really more and more with each passing decade. We've really started to see, we've started to see temperature take a sharp turn up. Does anybody remember that global warming hiatus, as it was called, in around 2012? So one person, do you want to mention kind of like what that was? Not why it happened, but just what does that mean, global warming hiatus?
I think there was a pause in the upward trend of the graph.
Right. Do you remember what sort of it created political squabbles and things like that?
It certainly did, because everybody said, what global warming? Obviously, we're seeing global cooling, you know? And so, yeah.
That's exactly right. You can actually YouTube congressional hearings where they're sort of putting scientists on the spot, explain that, why has CO2 gone up, but temperatures have stabilized? Well, the global warming hiatus, looking back, was this period here. So this is what all the politicians started getting up in arms about and saying, see, global warming's a hoax, temperatures aren't going up after all. Well, you can see what happened very quickly after that. So we come from California, and we are on the road for climate action, starting from the west, and we want to really tailor our talk to talk about climate impacts as we've been encountering them, as we've been coming from California, which is actually a very drought-prone state. It's a fire-prone state. But what we've been seeing is increasing fire activity, increasing major wildfires, more area burned every single year, more higher number of major wildfires every single year. This table here shows the top 20 largest wildfires in California on record. These are the ones that have occurred just in the last 2 decades. So basically this entire table has been turned over in just 2 decades. That's because the fires have just been getting more and more intense. Just last fall, we saw 3 of our largest wildfires on record, including our #1 largest wildfire on record. But you can see that if you look at the top here, this Thomas fire, this was our largest fire on record, but it just got trumped in August. We had a new wildfire, which doubled 280,000 acres to 450,000 acres burned. So last year's massive wildfire is already yesterday's news. We've got a new record this year. This trend is a bit concerning. Studies have shown that it's not just California that's drying out and getting subject to increasing wildfires. It's most of the West and even parts of Canada. We've seen over about a 30 or 40 year period from around the 1950s to the 1970s. If you compare that window of time to the current window, like since the year 2000, wildfires have increased 4-fold. The number of major wildfires have increased. The area burned by these wildfires has increased by about 6 times. So we're seeing 6 times more area burned per year due to wildfires in the earlier time period. And the wildfire window, which is basically when fires start in the season to when the last fire starts in the season, that window of time is 70 days longer today than it was about 35 or so years ago. So this is definitely something that is concerning, and it's really having impacts to not just California, but also Nevada. Ranch lands are getting converted from grasslands to little shrubby wooded plants, which isn't conducive to ranching. That's sort of how fires are affecting areas like Nevada. And also, aside from wildfires, we're just seeing more heat. And places like Nevada, which are already really hot, we were talking to people there, and we didn't know that a lot of people raise chickens in Nevada, but people were saying that their chickens are dying. And one lady told us she now knows the temperature at which a chicken dies at. It's 117 degrees. And other people, similar stories. The Nevada, Las Vegas area has seen about 16 more triple-digit days this year than the average. They've already got about 70 of these triple-digit days per year. So they're at 87 this year. And Reno, just neighboring Reno, had its hottest July on record. We then traveled to Utah, and by the way, when we got to Utah, we entered an area that looked like it was a storm, and I told Athena, hey, look, we're about to enter a rainstorm. And as we got closer, didn't seem to be raining, but I didn't know where the fog could be coming from. Turns out it was smoke. We hadn't even escaped the California smoke by the time we got to Utah from the fires. And even as far as Wyoming, we were still inundated by California wildfire smoke, at least according to the residents there. I'll let Athena tell you a little bit about the bark beetle as we move through Utah and into Colorado. Oh yeah, Charles, did we end up getting audio or?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so we'll try that out while she talks.
So we went to Utah and we had a little bit of free time, so we decided to go to Cedar Breaks National Monument. Has anyone here been there or heard of it? Oh, you have? It's beautiful. We'd never heard of it or been there, but we decided to take a little detour, and this monument is located at about 10,000 feet of elevation. So on our drive to the monument, we were noticing dead trees along the way, and we were wondering what these trees, what was killing these trees. We thought maybe it's fire, but they didn't look burned, and we just weren't really sure what was going on. So as we continued up to the monument, here's an image of what we were seeing with the dead trees. We learned from the rangers there that this area is actually being impacted by the bark beetle, and we knew about the bark beetle. We were expecting to see the bark beetle when we spent the day with the rangers at Rocky Mountain National Park, but we did not know that the bark beetle was a big problem in Utah at this point. So we continued on our way, and
all right, so I will click on this. I think it should work. These are our videos here.
Do you want me to do the next slide before you start the video?
Yeah, sure. You can go to the next slide here. So this was what we saw next.
Yeah, so here's an image of what we saw next when we went on our hike. So not sure if you can see because it looks like something's still in the way. So all of this brown area on top here is all dead forest. And that area has been killed by the bark beetle. So does everyone know what the bark beetle is, what it does? Well, that's actually a great segue into our video. So we next went to Rocky Mountain National Park, where we were really fortunate to spend about 3 or 4 hours with some rangers who took us around the park and were showing us what they're dealing with bark beetle at epidemic levels. So we were able to put together this short video where the rangers helped us understand what the bark beetle does and what they're dealing with right now.
We're on our way to document the bark beetle destruction in the Colorado Rocky Mountain National Park. Starting to see some lodgepole damage from the bark beetle as we get up into these higher altitudes. Wow. Alright, so I'm here at Rocky Mountain National Park with Chelsea, a very informed ranger who's been telling us about the bark beetle impacts to the park. I'm holding a little sample of 2 bark beetles. They're about the size of a grain of rice. Very small, but not insignificant. Chelsea, could you tell us a little bit about what we're standing next to and basically a little bit about the bark beetle's impacts to the forest?
Yeah, so we are standing right near one of the lodgepole pine trees of Rocky Mountain National Park. This is a tree that has grown up in Rocky. It's a native tree to the area. The beetles are also a native tree to the area, and this is the preferred host to what we refer to as the mountain pine beetle. So as a mountain pine beetle emerges in the summer, it can come into these trees. It bores through the bark of the trees, hence the name bark beetle. If a tree is healthy enough, it can pitch that beetle out using its sap, but unfortunately, because of conditions within our forest, a lot of these trees aren't healthy enough to do that, and they succumb to the beetle. The beetle gets inside the tree, gets into the bark, it spreads a fungus to the bark, which will eventually overwhelm the tree and kill the tree.
Now, could you tell viewers, what does this have to do with climate change, and how is climate change leading to more bark beetle destruction?
Definitely. So climate impacts have a big role in bark beetle and the epidemic levels of bark beetles that we're seeing in the park right now. When the beetle bores into a tree, it can lay eggs. Those eggs will larvate, and those larvae will then stay underwintered in the bark. And if it's cold enough temperatures in the wintertime, the larvae have potential to be frozen out. They'll die, and they won't emerge the next years as adult beetles. But we haven't seen cold enough temperatures in our winter times in Rocky Mountain National Park since the early 80s. So without that cold temperature, that means that all the beetles are able to become adults. The next year, they'll become an adult form, they'll fly out of the tree, they'll find a new host tree, and they'll get into that tree, spread the fungus, and the cycle goes on and on and on to the point now that we're seeing epidemic levels of the beetle in the park.
Wow, thank you. We're about to tour a little bit through some higher elevations and capture some of the footage of the widespread bark beetle destruction of the forest. However, right now we're going to get out of the rain because it's starting to come down on us. Thanks.
Yeah, so again, we felt really fortunate to have the time to spend with the park rangers. They were really informative. And then just one more thing to mention about Cedar Breaks National Monument, as we were learning about the bark beetle infestation that they're having there. We also asked what other climate impacts they're seeing, and the ranger told us about some indicator species like the pika that lives up at this monument, which, like I said, is at a very high elevation of about 10,000 feet, and this animal cannot withstand temperatures above 85 degrees. So the temperature is rising, and now this pika species doesn't really have anywhere else to go because it already lives at these high elevations. And so they're calling that an indicator species of the changing climate. So also at Rocky Mountain National Park, we talked about the bark beetle, and we also learned about some other climate impacts that they're seeing there. So we were lucky enough to go up to the tundra, which is about 11 to 12,000 feet. And Chelsea was telling us about the different species that live up there. This year, their snowpack melted 2 weeks early, so she was telling us about some of the implications of that. Something that I found really interesting was some of these species that live up there in the tundra, they turn white in the winter to camouflage in with the snow, and they actually turn back to brown or other colors to camouflage with the ground, not when the snow melts, but when the length of the day gets to be a certain length. So with this earlier snowpack, that meant for these animals that they didn't change from white back to their color, so they weren't able to camouflage with the ground because they were waiting for the length of the day to change. So that put them in danger for predators because they stood out like a sore thumb. So after that, we continued and we visited some farms. The first farm we visited was Johnson Family Farms over here in South Dakota. And we asked the farmers what they're noticing from the different changing climate. And Charlie told us that their farms there in South Dakota are not irrigated. So they rely on natural rainfall. And he said that their rain patterns have been changing. So now they have longer times with no rain. Sometimes they have a week or 2 weeks with no rain, and it's not as reliable anymore, so they're seeing longer, almost like drought periods. And again, these farms are not irrigated, so that's been difficult for them moving forward with their farming practices. Then we came over, we met with Jim Riddle, who has an organic berry farm in Minnesota. It was a great visit, and he told us something also related to rain. They're not getting more rain every year, but they're getting larger rain events. So they'll get a lot of rain in a short time, and that's been ruining a lot of their fields and a lot of their crops. He told us about one of his neighbors, who's a potato farmer, and they got one of these big rain events, and all the potatoes were uncovered. They all rotted, and he could not fulfill his contract with Whole Foods. So definitely impacting farmers in these areas that we visited. So then we continue to the northeast, specifically Massachusetts and the New England area, and we talked to residents there about sea level rise, and they're concerned about that in the coastal communities like Cape Cod. We also learned and heard from them that they're seeing more insects and different insects, and actually from the CDC, in just the last 12 years, from 2004 to 2016, so in a 12-year period, tick diseases have doubled in the United States, and a lot of that is Lyme disease. We talked with some people about seasonal changes and cold snaps, so we went apple picking and we asked the farmers at the apple orchard if they're seeing any changes in the climate, and they told us that the winters are getting so cold, they're having extreme cold temperatures and it's killing the buds. So I didn't know this, but buds live throughout the winter and they emerge in the spring. But because these extreme lows they're having, these buds are actually killed in the winter. So they don't emerge in the spring, and they're losing, last year they lost their peach crop, and those cold days are impacting a lot of their crops. And now the bark beetle is expanding its territory due to these warming winters, warming averages, and moving into states like Massachusetts and elsewhere. Do we want to talk about that now?
Yeah, I think Carl, you had mentioned that you may actually facilitate some Q&A about climate impacts in this area. So maybe we'll just leave that to that point. Usually in the middle of the talk, we'll ask people how the climate's been changing, but it sounds like we might do that afterwards.
Yeah, we might talk about that at the end.
Okay. Yeah, so just kind of stemming what Athena said, Boston, for instance, which is, really freezing in the winter, I lived there for 6 years, they had a new record high, which was 12-degree high in the middle of winter. So usually it's cold there, but 12-degree high was a record low for a daily high. So that's the kind of thing that these peach farmers, apple farmers are saying is actually bad for their crops, even these winter-adapted crop species. So elsewhere, even in spite of these record freezing temperatures, places like Boston and all around the Northeast, as many of you can attest, are having these anomalously record warm periods in the middle of February. It'll turn 70 degrees or so, quite erratic. But the warming side of things is obviously having issues for not just the Cape Cod and the Northeast sea levels, but also the South. We'll be traveling through Florida and Louisiana to be talking to people on the ground there about how they're concerned with sea level rise, what climate sentiment is kind of like in that area. There's a famous calculation, you can't read it here, but if the whole Greenland ice sheet were to melt, it would raise sea levels by 20 feet. So that's an incredibly high amount of high sea level. It's not going to happen today, tomorrow, or even next year. But with climate change, we're not concerned just about next year. We're concerned about decades out and more of the long-term future. And in fact, places like big glacial coverage is retreating at a record pace. So we should definitely be concerned about sea level rise. Warming temperatures are not only raising sea levels, melting ice raising sea levels, but they're also turning coral reefs from this to this to this. Basically, anybody remember the 2016 record bleaching event that happened? So about a 30% of the Great Barrier Reef died. It became white from this extreme warming sea surface temperatures, and ultimately perished. Now, coral reefs can repair themselves, by the way, but it takes about 20 years to do so. And these high temperature events are causing bleaching about once per decade, and projected to be about 2 times per decade moving into the future. So that exceeds the ability of these reefs to recover from. And this is a problem not just for snorkelers, but for the 1 billion or so people who depend on these ecosystems for their main source of protein, which is fish. Coral reefs often thought of as the tropical rainforest of the sea. They only cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but they house about 25% of marine biodiversity. So extremely important ecosystems. We've also been seeing more intense hurricanes. This is a picture of Houston last fall when it went underwater from a storm that dropped more rainfall onto the city than any prior storm in the contiguous U.S. On record. And it's not just Harvey, it was Irma, which set a world record just about 2 weeks later, highest sustained wind speed of any hurricane in the world ever recorded, and then Maria, which basically wiped out major parts of Puerto Rico, left thousands of people dead after you account for loss of electricity, access to food, water, and things like that. Climatologists have been telling us for quite some time that the more we warm the globe, the more sea surface temperatures rise, which basically provides the fuel and the energy to turn Category 3 and 4 hurricanes into Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. So that's the climate connection that we should be worried about as we move into the future. We just saw Florence. It's really something that we should, it's problematic. So there's some common misconceptions that I think it's always fun to debunk as it relates to climate change. I talk about 50 of them in my book, but it's something we can also talk a little bit about today. But I like to let the audience choose a couple to determine where we go. So here are a few misconceptions, and maybe we can get a show of hands in terms of which ones. Maybe we'll pick 2, and we can just kind of cover them briefly. So it's too late for the climate. Electric cars aren't really that green. The public is, quote, divided about climate change. Green energy is killing jobs, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions is too costly. So maybe we can take a show of hands for 1 through 5. How about 1? It's too late for the climate. How about 2? Electric cars are not that really that green. Couple. 3, the public is divided about climate change. 3, it's a tie. Green energy is killing jobs. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is too costly. Okay, so we'll definitely cover that one, and then it's kind of a ballpark toss between these. Let's do the electric car one.
You can say the public is divided.
Exactly, that's true. Okay, so we'll start with the electric cars aren't that green because it's my next slide. So let's talk about that briefly. So one of the reasons why the electric cars aren't really that green myth is a myth because, for one thing, you get efficiency gains right off the bat when you buy an electric car. The electric engine is already more efficient. Gas combustion engines tend to do a bad job of converting gasoline potential energy into actual forward motion. They lose a lot of energy as heat, which you can all attest to. Your engine can get really, really hot. So electric cars are much more efficient at converting energy into forward motion. So you get gains right off the bat when you have that internal engine, or lack of engine. The other piece of this is the idea, the notion that where that sort of misconception comes from is that we're plugging into a grid, and we can't be silly. That grid is electricity, and electricity comes from somewhere. In the U.S., we still get a lot of our electricity from fossil fuels. So yes, that is true, but we're not just getting it from coal. This isn't a 100% coal country. We have still about 20% nuclear. We still have a fair amount of hydro, and we're increasingly replacing coal with natural gas. These are all comparatively lower emissions, CO2 emissions causing than something like a pure coal grid. So we are talking about a mixed grid. And the beauty is, as we continue to move towards a greener grid, where electricity is increasingly coming from solar and from wind, we are actually paving the way for a zero emissions, much greener future. So it's true that electric cars are not zero emission vehicles. You'd have to be somewhere in Norway where before you really approach a zero emission vehicle. Norway is mostly powered by, I think it's like 90% hydro. But we're increasingly, the more we move to this direction, the greener these get, and still in most states, and still in most states, we're talking about electric cars that are greener than their gas counterparts. Okay, so we're going to pass this one. Okay, so this is the question about the misconception about it's too costly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is cost. There's a cost associated with bringing down our CO2 and our methane emissions and so forth. But we can't consider the cost of action without considering the cost of inaction. So I'd like to take this couple minutes to talk about just one piece of the puzzle, which is the extreme weather-related, climate-related natural disasters that we've been seeing, and what the sort of cost is associated with these events. I'll preface that by saying that the U.S. does keep track of, since about the 80s, billion-dollar or more natural disasters. So these are events such as wildfires, floods, hurricanes that are big enough to cost about $1 billion to the U.S. economy. So let's talk about 2016, when we saw 15 major natural disasters. Again, these are billion-dollar or more events. They cost about almost $50 billion to the U.S. economy. This is no small number. Bear in mind that when we withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, one of the things that the president mentioned is, we can't waste billions of dollars helping other countries convert to green energy. They've got to do it alone, which, by the way, they probably are unlikely to do without help. We've already pledged $1 billion. That's already too much. So to put that billion in perspective, we're talking about almost 50 billion just in 1 year of climate-related natural disasters. Of course, not all of those are related to warming temperatures, but there's definitely, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, what is 15 if we don't know the background? Well, since 1980, when these records began, the average is about 5-6 storms, $1 billion or more storms per year. So we're 3 times over the average here in 2016. Now, I used to use these numbers when I would do climate talks, not knowing that 2017 would actually lend much more persuasive numbers. So let's see what happened in 2017. We had 16 disasters, one more, and $300 billion in cost to the economy. So now we're talking about almost $250 billion that was incurred as a result of the massive hurricanes, the massive wildfires, again, which are linked to which scientists are telling us we can expect more of, I should say, when we continue to warm the globe. So again, we can't consider the cost of action without considering this cost of inaction. That cost appears to be growing with each year. And this is just looking at $1 billion or more natural disasters in this country. Not talking about all the little smaller disasters or all the other things related to climate change that we could talk about, one of which would be poor air quality coming from fossil fuels and the burden that puts on public health. So I'm only one person, there's nothing I can do. This is definitely a misconception that I want to cover. So we've been to a bunch of climate presentations. I've been to very many. Never in the last solutions slide of the presentation did I ever see a bullet point that said, go on the road for climate action. This is something that sort of was our own manifestation of asking ourselves, what can we do to sort of fill the gap to bring science to the public, to get the word out there on climate science and do some outreach. Now, I don't think that we all need to do what we're doing. It's just our own version, but I think that the more we ask ourselves what we can do differently and sort of be creative and trying to get the word out, get us moving towards solutions, the better. I think one thing that we probably all come to learn is that there's no one else taking care of the problem. Sadly, there's been congressional deadlock on climate solutions for as long as we've had Congress. So there's just nothing happening on a major level. And we were actually talking to Senator Warren's office today, who was totally on board with doing stuff about climate change, Elizabeth Warren. And we were talking to her staffer, and she was saying that climate change is still, although the senator finds it important, it's not something that they foresee a massive solution coming about for until there's just enough pressure coming in, until there's enough people calling their congressmen, calling their senators and saying, we want a price on carbon, or we want X, Y, Z. That's still not the sort of phone call that's flooding in, and that's still going to be the hurdle, if we want to get real solutions, and we need to tell our politicians that we want them. So that was an interesting conversation. Athena put this slide in, which is quite cute. If you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. I've been itching my ankle all presentation, so this resonates personally with me today. Right now we have really a divided, a divided government on climate change. It turns out one of the misconceptions that was listed, which I didn't mention, was that the public is divided on climate change. And we're actually increasingly seeing that the public isn't divided on climate change. There's only about, and this is using polling data from Gallup poll and also work out of Yale Center for Climate Communications, that only about 10% of the US public is what is often called a climate skeptic, or somebody who just won't have it, doesn't think anything's going on with the climate, or doesn't think humans have a role to play. But the other 90% are not in that camp, and that actually agrees with some research that I'm doing right now, looking at how people are talking about climate change on Twitter. Only find about 10% of people are talking about a climate hoax or something of that nature. The rest are concerned and actually want to see action. Recent Gallup poll, 45% of Americans are, quote, very concerned about global warming. So while the government is a little bit divided on this issue, and it could be a little bit awkward to talk about, one of the most underrated things we can all do as a public is to continue to talk about climate change, broach that conversation with our neighbors, colleagues, or friends. It's really one of the most underrated things we can do. And given the polling, what it suggests is that fewer people than you think will actually be closed off to hearing about it. We were surveying people in rural Utah at a hunting shop. The owner and manager, anonymous survey, their response on the survey was that they do believe climate change is happening and that humans play somewhat of a role in it. That's not something that you would have necessarily thought if you kind of read about the divide of the climate divide among the public. So I encourage everybody to use these platforms or just have conversations in your own lives with people that you wouldn't otherwise talk to about the climate. One person in Boulder, Colorado, we should probably do this more often, but we try to get people to raise their hand and make sort of a climate pledge. And this one gentleman said, I pledge to talk about climate change with one new person every week, or I think it was maybe every few days. So that was kind of neat, and I think that using these media platforms is another way we can do that. NASA, EPA, NOAA, there's a lot of great, not necessarily technical studies or anything, but just articles that are meant for the public to read, which we can increasingly share online and sort of get in the news space. More people use Facebook for their news now than ever before. We're really big on civic duty. I'm sure we have a lot of voters in the audience. If you're not, you can get registered to vote. If you're registered to vote, you can register other people to vote. Talk about climate change and the importance that we all really have to pay to this issue, and really call our congressmen, call our congresswomen, and demand that they have that they incorporate climate change into their platform, and put a bill forward that asks for putting a price on carbon. Citizens Climate Lobby does a lot of doing a lot to try to get what they call a carbon fee and dividend passed through Congress. And what this basically is putting a price on carbon dioxide emissions to make it more costly for companies to pollute the atmosphere. If we want to disincentivize that, then we have to do it economically. Knocking on the door and asking them to do it out of the goodness of their heart isn't going to work, I promise you. So charging them for emissions is the way that economists have been arguing to do this for years. The most economically efficient way to do it that isn't going to be unfair to certain industries or burden, cause economic inefficiencies, as they would call it. So it's a very logical thing. It's what we do at the hazardous waste site. When companies want to dump hazardous waste, they got to pay a price for it. That keeps companies thinking about how they can produce less waste. Same thing that we got to do for the atmosphere. You can learn more about that on the CCL website or talk to me after. The air pollution problem also gets cleaned up as we move from fossil fuels to wind and solar and geothermal and all these other exciting technologies. We still have 200,000 people in this country dying every year just as a result of poor air quality from asthma, pulmonary COPD, and things like that. So by putting climate change completely aside, if we just look at poor air quality, the biggest reason for poor air quality in the country is the same thing that's releasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's the burning of coal, oil, natural gas, and as we shift away from that, we really take care of a second problem, which is not a negligible problem. Detroit, we interviewed an environmental justice NGO, and they said that 2 to 3 people died per day on average in the area just due to air pollution in the metropolitan area. Do you want to talk a little bit about the carbon footprint and then
Sure.
segue into the last portion?
Yeah. So we do like to talk about carbon footprint, although we both think, and of course Shahir knows better than I do, but that reducing our own personal carbon footprint isn't going to be the answer to solving the climate change problem. We need something bigger, something overarching, but at the same time, that's not to say that we shouldn't try to do everything that we can to change our lifestyle and adjust our lifestyle and try to be responsible consumers. And we can't really talk about reducing our carbon footprint without talking about diet. So this is a little chart that shows the greenhouse gas emissions associated with different products. And I know you can't see what's going on down here, but I'll start from here. We have lamb, beef, cheese, pork, salmon, turkey, chicken. Still haven't said anything that's a vegetable or a bean. So you can just see from looking at this chart that animal products are much higher. They have higher greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So something that we can all do is eat less meat. And that doesn't mean we have to be a vegetarian or a vegan tomorrow, but our decisions do have consequences, and something we can do is start to just eat less meat. Also transportation, so Shahir bikes to work. Not everybody can bike to work, but we can carpool, and we can, if we're going to get a new vehicle, try to get something with good miles per gallon, or if we can, a hybrid or an electric vehicle. So these are some things we can think about in terms of transportation. So Shahir was interviewing a professor at MIT, was it MIT?
Yeah.
And he asked him, what would be one thing you would tell people to reduce their carbon footprint? And this professor said, put a sweater on in the winter. So this is something we can do to try to, live with the temperature that we are having outside. We don't have to have a hot day outside and a cold wintry day inside an air conditioner. So if we can just try to, dress and live according to the season a little bit more, we can really be able to use the air conditioner less and use our heating units less. So some other things, I'm sure a lot of you are already involved, but there are a lot of great organizations that are already doing a lot of work on climate change. So there are student groups, there are groups like CCL, there are groups like the group that's being hosted today, which is Climate Stewards, right? Yeah. So we can get involved in a group. We don't need to reinvent the wheel or do things that, think of something new. There are a lot of groups that have some really well thought out plans on how we can address this issue. 350.org. And also on the Road for Climate Action, which is our group. We've had volunteers write op-eds for us. This one got published in the LA Times, which was awesome. We've also been featured on the Citizens Climate Lobby blog, and that was from someone who decided to do a write-up for us, which was awesome. And just to show you a map and remind you of our project, so we're going on a 35 state, it's actually now a 36 state trip. So we've come all this way along the north. Now we're about here. In a week we'll be in Florida, and over the next few weeks we'll be on the way back to California. We have a website too, so we'll be passing out some papers to each of you that have our website and our email or Gmail account, which we check every day. Some information for you, and you can check out our website. We also have a weekly newsletter that we send out to whoever would like to sign up. So we'll pass it around my computer. We used to have people writing their emails, but it's very hard to read all the different handwritings.
If you want to sign up for the weekly newsletter, we'll pass the laptop around, and that way we can read everyone's email perfectly. So if you don't want to sign up, just pass it along now.
Yeah, so this newsletter is 2 pages long, so it's this page and then another page, and it just sums up our week, what we've done, what we've learned, some exciting things that are going on the road, so on our tour. And we'll only email you once a week, so that will be the only time we'll email you if you do decide to sign up for the newsletter. And we also do have a GoFundMe page, as we're both taking time away from work, which has been great. So feel free to share it, or no donation is too small.
We have a link on the website also, as well as a little thing up there.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about Beyond Debate?
Yeah, sure. So there's a book that's been staring at you in the face for the last hour, and that book is called Beyond Debate: Answers to 50 Misconceptions on Climate Change. The title is somewhat self-explanatory in terms of what's in the book. The reason I wrote the book was basically because we've been, when I finished grad school and started my postdoc, I got out of sort of the Harvard bubble and the graduate school bubble and became increasingly interacting with some of my friends back from California as I moved back home, and sort of immersed more in daily conversation outside of just sort of peers and colleagues in the science department. And I was hearing talk of this climate debate quite a bit, and hearing all these wild misconceptions that I knew the scientists weren't talking about, and they just weren't standing up to the science. So I looked for a book that I could sort of disseminate to people that would correct all those misconceptions, and I didn't find it. So I decided to write it. And that's basically what this book is here. It's about 6 weeks old. And some of the things I talk about are the fact that CO2 isn't actually a net positive. Sure, it's good for plants, but the story is more complicated than that. I was at a chili cook-off about a year ago. I asked somebody at a political booth what they thought about the Paris Climate Accord withdrawal, and they told me that, oh, it's fine, climate change isn't a human-caused thing, it's actually caused by volcanic activity. So I dedicated a chapter to answering that question, and there's other things as well. Everything you've heard today in this presentation is in this book and much more, so it's really something that lets me talk more than just an hour, but 300 pages worth, and that's sort of something that's exciting. So we have them today. Of course, all the book sales go to supporting the project, and they're $15 cheaper than on Amazon. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming here to our talk. Thanks to Citizens Climate Lobby and Pale Blue Dot is offsetting our emissions as we travel across the country by investing in a methane capture project, which is really exciting. Thank you very much. So yeah, we're happy to, Carl, actually, we'll turn it over to you. You wanted to say a few things? Or... Oh, and we have 3 bumper stickers up there. They say register, learn, think, vote. So feel free to grab one afterwards.
Right. Well, when we first talked about this, we got together with Citizens Climate Lobby and thought we could kind of have a discussion about, a little bit about how what they learned driving across the country would, what we could add to that and what resonates with what's going on here, and a little bit more about how you talk to people and how we can talk to people here and what's going on locally, in addition to what CCL is doing federally, to kind of put what you've learned into action. So we originally talked to a number of groups. Unfortunately, everything fell through. There's with the air pollution, I'll tell you a little bit about what's coming up. Specifically next month on October 11th, we are having a discussion specifically on air pollution, which Kim can tell you a little bit about more. But we also, I reached out to a number of people on the Maryland Climate Commission, so unlike the federal level, Maryland's pretty active on climate change and at least is willing to give lots of good lip service to it, and that mostly comes out of the Climate Change Commission. But we haven't had a lot of connection with them, so I wanted to get a little bit more than that. Unfortunately, the same woman who's going to come next month from the Maryland Environmental Health Network was planning to come tonight, but she has basically lost her voice and is working on a deadline that's come up that's tomorrow. So that didn't work out. But we'll hear more about that and more about how some of those the issues will, especially the pollution issues, next month on October 11th. And as far as very local issues, there's a candidates forum on October 23rd, on Tuesday, October 23rd, for the candidates local to here, so Annapolis, at the, I believe it's the Baywitch Christian Church. It's not here, with a number of environmental organizations. So we'll be putting out more information on that as it comes. But it's as Shahir says, talking to Senator Warren, not only is it important to hear what the candidates have to say on this. I know the county executive candidates have been invited, and I suspect at this point that the incumbent will not be attending. But I think it's important for as many of us to get to these events so that we can also share with candidates how important this issue is to us. So with that, I would, you had the slide up on local effects, and I think it would be good to kind of talk about the local effects here and how we can use those to engage with the people that are not writing the letters to Elizabeth Warren and are not showing up at the candidates' events to talk about climate and encourage them to do so.
Yeah, and we'll take notes as you shout out or read about different climate impacts, because one of the exciting things about our journey is hearing from different communities, and we have been writing down what we've been hearing across the country. So I'll have my pen busy as people are talking.
Does the red tide have anything to do with the climate?
The what?
The red tide down in Florida?
That's something that I can't answer with total confidence because I'm not 100% sure. I mean, it could be, it could have something to do with sea surface temperatures, which is of course linked to climate. But there's other things that play into different, these like sort of algal bloom events, which have to do with water runoff and marine pollution and things like that. So
When you go down to Florida and come up the west coast, if it's still there, we have relatives there, and they literally went on a week's vacation because they can't get in the water there. So they went further away. They can't enjoy the water. They're saying like the fishermen and all kinds of things are impacted by this red tide.
Yeah, we're going to be visiting Longboat Key, which is on one of the keys on that side. My friend's grandmother lives there, so we'll be stopping to see her and see how things are going.
Hammer Island.
yeah, if you email us that question when we're on our leaving Florida, I think I'll have an answer for you about the climate. Yeah, I know that.
Oh yeah, I have a twofold question. One, I understand a little bit how we figured out 400,000 years ago how much carbon dioxide was there.
Yeah.
One question I had was, how do we know what the temperature was?
It's a good question, yeah. And I talk about it in the book a little bit more, but in short, There's isotopic, what they call, different elements have different isotopes, which is it's the same element, but there can be like a heavier or a lighter version of those elements. Turns out it's the case of ocean water, there's actually, so light water, as they call it, tends to evaporate more than heavy water, so a higher proportion actually enters the atmosphere. And then that actually will result in a higher amount of, if there's a lot of evaporation, you'll get a higher amount of this light isotope in the ice sheets. So that means that basically you're measuring, you're looking at ice going down millions of years, you can actually tell that there was, so the poles are always, pretty cold, but you can tell that there was an accumulation of this light isotope at the time, which must have meant there was a lot of evaporation from the oceans at the time. So you can link that with temperature. There's other interesting ways of using isotopes to infer temperature when you look at ocean sediments. Instead of ice cores, you can take ocean sediment cores. And the isotopes of carbon actually are linked with basically when marine organisms pull carbon out of the ocean, they pull it disproportionate with ocean temperatures as well. So you can actually look at the isotopes that were in buried shell debris essentially and infer what the ocean temperatures were at that time.
The question I have is also, is there a point where, it becomes a runaway train where the permafrost melts enough that you have so much methane that the biggest CO2 producer is no longer us?
Yes.
Even if we stop tomorrow,
Yes.
is there a point where it's going to just be a worse and worse greenhouse and it doesn't matter?
Yes, there is a point, and the thing is we don't know exactly what that point is, which kind of makes our current predicament that much more frightening is, are we at that, what's often called tipping point? And we're not quite sure, but we know that when we get there, the other side of it is not good, because basically what the gentleman referred to is what they call positive feedback systems. So as we heat up the planet, we're also sort of shrinking the snow on the Earth, which means we're reflecting less light. So forget about whatever caused the initial warming, just reflecting less light is going to cause its own amount of warming. The same thing as we melt the tundra and we start to see methane get released from the biodegradation of the soil. Well, now we've got a whole new source of methane and CO2 emissions, aside from our cars and trucks and everything. And if we really kickstart that ball in motion, it doesn't really matter that we're suddenly shifting to like electric or hydrogen fuel cells, because now we've just unleashed the tundra and it's on a runaway train. So yeah, that's frightening. And actually, James Hansen from NASA writes about what they call Venus syndrome, which is the extreme case of that, where we go into a runaway heating effect, and then the planet like turns into a fireball. But we don't want to go down that way.
Right. I would say to that I wouldn't say that there is a tipping point, right? There's a number of tipping points that we pass that we wouldn't be able to go back from. So the mere fact that we trigger a tipping point doesn't mean that we're to the point where there's no longer anything we can do. I mean, we've got to go far enough down that road that we actually get the runaway train.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that a big piece of the climate change predicament is going to be, it doesn't matter as much if we adapt, if we have time to adapt, and a lot of what's important is relates to how we sort of the measures we take today are basically measures to sort of slow this whole train down and maybe prevent some sort of runaway effect. And the trajectories for ocean sea level rise, for instance, range from a foot of sea level rise to 8 feet by the end of this century. Those are the serious projections for sea level rise. So whether we go to 1 feet or 8 feet of rise by the end of the century depends entirely on how we act today and whether we sort of reduce CO2 emissions, methane emissions quickly, or we go down that business as usual track. You've been having your hand up for a while.
What makes you think we haven't passed the tipping point?
I mean, I don't think that. So again, I don't think that scientists know exactly when this sort of tipping point is. And as Carl mentioned, it's not necessarily like a finite thing that we're going to be able to identify, but there's definitely every reason to not try to find that out empirically and try to do what we can today to sort of prevent us from figuring that out.
Yeah, but the question is, how do we know we haven't passed it?
We don't.
Well, thank you.
We'll know in retrospect.
Well, yeah, right. But we can find out maybe Joe?
Right here in Annapolis, we see flooding down on the city dock more and more frequently. This summer it's been particularly bad. I watch the docks around my house. The number of days all you see is pilings. It's over a dozen days this summer that's the case. So all the fixed docks are now going underwater on a regular basis. I know Miami's already rebuilding their whole waterfront, trying to deal with the fact that the city's now below water level, becoming a New Orleans situation. We're going to have that in Annapolis, and not in the too distant future. A foot rise. Won't necessarily put all the parking areas underwater, but it'll be much more frequent than it has been. We have roads flooding on a regular basis around here. Some of it's from the high level of rain. We've gotten ridiculous amounts of rain this year, but all those, I have to believe, are attributable to the changing weather patterns that we're seeing. You have no rain on the west, and we got 16 inches in July. So there's costs that are going to be realized before. Farms going under because of, you talked about chicken farmers who can't raise their chickens anymore. And all these are going to be adding costs all over the place. So when we talk about the cost of the storms, that's only one aspect. There's the billions of dollars that we're going to have to invest in to redesign cities, to redesign New York City, to Washington, D.C.
Then you're getting into much more, much harder topics.
Well, Boston just recently voted that they were not going to enclose their harbor in a seawall. That happened, I think, toward the beginning of the summer. They were actually looking at, and Annapolis is looking at putting in seawalls and putting in pumps to actually close off the Eagle Alley. But you can see it around the Chesapeake Bay also, just in the winters. The Severn River used to freeze hard enough that regularly, every year, that people used to go out ice fishing. They would drive their cars, and they would ice skate, from sort of the area where Arlington Echo is, all the way up to Annapolis, just for fun. Right. So that hasn't happened, in decades and decades. If we get a thin skim of ice, it's a remarkable event.
Have you seen that movie We Are All Smith Islanders?
No.
So the kids always used to have ice skates and know how to skate. They don't know how anymore because it kind of freezes.
We heard that complaint from someone in Philadelphia a couple of days ago that they can't ice skate like they used to. And ski, and to the driving car over the ice. We were up by Lake Erie in Ohio. Apparently Lake Erie doesn't freeze over in the winter very much anymore. You get like a thin ice sheet. You used to be able to, drive across it, and nowadays you wouldn't dare walk across it. We'll go here and then across.
Sort of change the question in here. I was interested a little more about what you could say about your interactions with your congressman.
Sure.
Given that he came off fairly skeptical in that it's natural weather change or climate change. What was it like?
I can give you both my meeting synopsises. One's documented in the book because what the interesting timeline is, I met with him last June, and I was sort of taken back by his perspective on this issue, and quite frankly, the ignorance that he showed about this issue, and the pessimism that he showed about even the scientific community, and talking about conspiracy between scientists and all this sort of far out stuff. And it was part of my inspiration to sort of write this, and I actually talk about that meeting with him in here, and I was happy to give him a copy of my book today and say, hey, this came partially as a result of our meeting last year. And I have answered some of your questions that you posed. Today's meeting was, so he used the same phrase which he used last year, which was, he called it, the CO2 theory with a rather dismissive roll of the eyes. Still not really on buying it, I guess you could say, and he does seem to have changed a little bit in his demeanor. Potentially, he's feeling threats from re-election coming in the midterms.
Yeah, our district is very,
Right on the fence.
yeah,
With all of our Congress people.
yeah, it's an exciting time there.
But yeah, he was still, he was saying kind of like what I mentioned at the beginning, that climate change is happening, but it's always happened. And what's the difference today? And he's just he's very skeptical of the consensus, not realizing that the consensus didn't emerge overnight. It was after, it's been a couple hundred years of becoming a consensus. And that sort of adds weight to a consensus. It's not like, this is a fad that suddenly emerged and nobody wants to refute it because you'll get isolated. That's not what we're talking about.
Don't you think it's because they don't want to believe it? Because if they have to believe it, then they have to change capitalism.
Well, I mean, I think that there's real creative ways we can address climate change. And before we have to end capitalism, we can do some really innovative things with technology and solar, wind, and geothermal that we're not even doing right now. We can electrify the fleet. We can start using creative ways of using hydrogen storage and things like that. But getting back to your question, he seems like he's supportive of things that we would think of as climate change solutions without really acknowledging that they're human related, which honestly is fine with me. If you don't acknowledge it, but you want to move towards solutions, then that's great. So he's talking about trying to do more with green energy electric storage, which is one of the problems with wind and solar, is that we need some storage to make sure that when the sun isn't up, we don't have no electricity. And that's kind of a common ground we found with him today. And tomorrow we'll be hopefully capturing some of this on video. He actually approved us to do some video, but he wants some time to think about what he's going to say. So we're supposed to be with him at 10:30
Yeah,
in the morning.
his staffer, or not his staffers, but his like PR people, a few of his people were kind of like, oh, well, you'll be back in California. I feel like they were trying to push the video interview, and he was like, they've come here from California, so he really seemed like he wanted to get on video, which who knows why, but
yeah,
it'll be exciting if we can get it on video.
Yeah, hopefully we can share that and bring it to the public. So tomorrow at 10:30, we have a 5-minute video clip scheduled, so we'll see what happens. Yeah.
All right.
And then we'll work our way across the year.
So you had talked about long-term cycles. And I can recall seeing a TV, I think it was on MPT, Maryland Public Television, which said that 15 million years ago, there were trees growing in Antarctica.
Yeah.
So clearly, the world was warmer then than it is now.
Right.
And nothing to do with humans.
Right.
Are there longer term cycles than the 100,000 year one?
Yeah, so those cycles are the more recent cycles. In fact, we could have taken that slide back about 1 million years and seen the same sort of regularity in those 100,000 year cycles. But if you go really far back, you'll see that Earth's climate has been to wild extremes, from the hothouse Earth that you're citing, which was circa 60 billion years ago or so, where we had trees in the Arctic Circle, we had crocodiles north of the Arctic, or poleward of the Arctic Circle, and no ice caps on planet Earth to speak of. It was a complete wet globe essentially. And then we've seen the opposite extreme around 70, actually I think it's 700 million years ago, where we had what they call snowball Earth. And there's actually snow extending, ice sheets extending from the poles all the way to through the equator. So we literally were on a snowball Earth, which is what gives it its name. In fact, that happened about twice in Earth's history. So yeah, Earth has been through some real wild extremes. Both of those were what you would call runaway effects, which led to the complete freezing of Earth, and then in the other case, the complete thawing of Earth. And those are not necessarily cycles that show the same regularity, but Earth has definitely been through some pretty extremes in the past. However, one thing that, so some people will say that maybe cite those two instances as, see, Earth has changed, but humans didn't go through that period, and we've only been a proven species for the recent history of Earth, which was the Holocene period, which has been characterized by remarkable climatic stability. So we haven't actually been a proven species through these extremes that Earth has been through. So that's sort of a test of time moving forward.
But how do you answer the question that when someone like your representative, for example, says it's a natural cycle, and he says, see, the entire planet was a.
Yeah, so I answered it today, I don't know if it mattered, but I did. And basically what I say is, sort of how I opened it today, which is, climate change is natural, it's always happened, it's always gonna happen, but what we're talking about is the rate of change, and that rate of change is dramatic. I mean, even through Earth's changes, even the ones that I talked about just now, the hot house Earth and the snowball Earth, those were still changes that occurred over tens of thousands of year time periods. So actually quite frighteningly, if you look at, has Earth ever been this hot or this cold, the answer is absolutely. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It's seen much crazier things than we're having today. But one thing that we can say with actual pretty good confidence is we don't think that Earth has actually ever seen this rapid of a change. So that is something that is quite alarming, with potential exceptions for the mass extinctions that occurred, one of which was around when the asteroid hit Earth and dinosaurs went extinct. Those are the exceptions, but in terms of these, but that's not one that you would take comfort in, right? So a whole species, we had a bottleneck where most species didn't survive. So yeah, it doesn't seem like we really have much to compare the present context to that was at least resulted in any kind of positive, impact to species. And then Margaret, you had a question.
I talked to a guy who lives on a farm in the Brandywine area that's about half an hour something south of here, near Route 4. He has kept a couple of horses, and he's been there 20 years. He said that his barn is flooded now, and barns aren't really supposed to flood. He's not right on a river or anything, and he's having to have work done on his property to make it so this doesn't happen again. Normally there would be horses there, and then he also said he was having trouble getting hay for the horses because the farmers in the area who might be making hay, well, their fields are too wet. And this is unusual for this time of year. I mean, normally I can't say anything personally, except my persimmon tree didn't have any surviving fruit this year, and last year it had 100 or something like that. But there you go, a couple of anecdotes.
And in Ohio, we were told that because of the delayed springs, the corn basically used to be ready by 4th of July in the area, and now they don't get their corn until like towards the middle of August and stuff. So it's kind of a cultural thing, which is unfortunate for the area. And then there was another question floating around. Okay, we'll go back to it.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was surprised that when you talk about food choices, you talk very specifically about what people can do to reduce their meat consumption. When you talk about the transportation issues, you don't bring up air travel at all. And that's, a lot of people, don't have the ability to bike to work or, may not have different choices in that sense, but can make choices about the amount of air travel that they take and the impact that has. So I was kind of wondering why that,
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just mention it now. There's no particular reason I left it out. Usually we're pressing through slides, but yeah, so air travel is definitely important. One of the things I actually do mention sometimes in the presentations is that we have a gorgeous country, and you can just go to so many beautiful local vacations rather than going halfway around the world on a flight to Fiji or something like that. Explore some of the local national parks and do things that could actually reduce your carbon footprint. So yeah, air travel is definitely important. And also with transportation, it doesn't have to be just riding a bike, which is impractical for everybody, but actually getting a car that's more efficient, not even necessarily, even if you put aside electric cars, some cars get double the mile per gallon that other cars get. And even if that car is a little more expensive, you're probably going to recover the cost shortly in terms of your gas savings. So yeah, absolutely. And then public transportation. I come from the West Coast, and it's terrible with public transportation. You guys actually have some pretty good mass transit on the eastern part of the country, so I would say take advantage of that as much as possible as well.
Do you know if anyone's ever looked at telework? Because I know
at
telework, because I know that originally people were talking about telework as a way of really reducing carbon emissions and congestion on the roads.
What is it called?
Telework, actually
Oh.
working at home.
Oh, I see. That's a
but-
question I have as well. I'm not sure the answer to it.
Well, one of the trends that I've noticed is that people tend to live even further from their jobs then. And so that they're working, possibly across the country and then flying, once a week or, once every few weeks to visit their offices. So
That's an interesting question, and that compensatory sort of factor is pretty disturbing if that's what happens. So I'm not sure that. I actually am curious to find out. And if you find out, please email me. In the back.
So I went down to the Senate House and we talked about different things with the Sierra Club last year. And one of the environmentalists there said that it's a big part of our problem here in our county is overdevelopment. And that they're cutting down a lot of trees and that's taking away the way that the moisture has a place to go. They're just building homes and more roads. And that's part of the reason why our county is flooding more than in past years. And if you go up, you probably don't know this, but if you go up by Fort Meade, it's just incredible. And out in Crofton, how much building is done.
Wow,
So that's part of our problem with the flooding, is water just isn't just dependent.
Yeah, that's true. The same thing is when we were passing through Ohio, where people have lost actually their homes, not to sea level rise, but to erosion, as these major floods just inundate the areas. Is urbanization and just the increased paving of our natural landscapes, which is, like you said, leaving the water nowhere to go, but rushing. So the more we can leave our soil permeable to water, the better. Maybe we'll take one or two more. Oh, go ahead.
With Cheryl.
Hi.
Yeah. Maybe we'll take one or two more, and then I know it's 8:30. I don't want to keep everyone, but yeah, go ahead.
Cliff and I came here from Howard County, Ellicott City. Ellicott City. Since you're in the area, we have three Ellicott City. You're not far from there, about 30 miles away. And I don't know, did you hear about our flooding events?
In Ellicott County?
Ellicott City, Maryland, Howard County.
Yeah, is that the one where basically cars were like floating?
That's the one.
Yeah.
I live about 4 miles from there.
Oh, wow.
And
Is your home
what happened, our home was okay because it's a narrow area with a lot of rocks along the side and just nowhere for massive amounts of rain in short periods of time to go. And when people talk about overdevelopment, which is a big issue in many areas, for Ellicott City, I like to point out it's the rain and how much it came down so quickly. And that's what's really unusual. And we had it happen in 2 years apart. They call it 1,000-year floods, 2 years apart.
Yeah.
And it was huge amounts of rain, very unusual in a very short period of time. And that's the real length of time.
And it was also made worse by unchecked development upstream. I mean, there's a lot of exchange of, porous surfaces for non-porous surfaces by developments of various types. So that certainly contributed to the problem as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why don't we take one more question, and then we'll hang around for a bit if you want to come up and talk to us, but that way other people have places to go. So last question, right here.
This is just a comment about air travel. There is at least one company that has developed aircraft for short and medium haul that are, believe it or not, electric. So I read about this like 6 months ago. They had built a prototype. I don't remember the name of the company. It's in testing and I don't know, certification or something like that. Obviously, for if you're going across oceans, this is not going to work. In the long haul, it's not going to work yet. But for short and medium haul, it is technologically, apparently, it is finished.
I also just want to follow up on the flying by saying that I have heard from some people what they do when they fly is like we have no blue dot offsetting us, so you can go to some of these offsetting companies to, whatever way, these different companies, whether it's methane capture or planting trees or whatever they're doing, you can offset some of your travels.
But over the long haul, I think we should probably look at our consumption. well. Does anybody have the laptop? And if anyone hasn't signed, okay, if there's anyone who hasn't signed that they wanted to, we have it up here, so feel free.
Yeah, well, I'll say a couple more words before, just about solutions and what's going on in addition to the events. So, and encourage everybody to, to take the most action we can. I think it is important. I mean, when we talk about things like buying a car, I mean, we are, when we're asking if we're beyond the tipping point or something, and we're talking about an action that's going to lock in what you're doing for the entire life cycle of your car, it's, we really need to be making the right decisions now, and encourage everyone to really do that. There is all the community solar information here that Carolyn can't be here tonight because I think it's the CBF function was rescheduled for tonight because of the storm that came through a week ago. So if you haven't heard from Carolyn and the options of community solar, the information's here. She'll be back later too if you want to ask questions. And there's a sign-in sheet there if you want to get more information from her. So as far as I wanted to touch on one other thing with you guys, and in terms of communication, you would put up social media and that kind of thing. I want to put in a plug for the CSGA and our website and our Facebook page. If you're looking for things to share about climate change, we post daily, so you can always go. If you're looking for things to share, looking for topics to talk about with your friends, we put up a list of news that's relevant to climate change, and we try and focus it on Maryland and Annapolis on the website, so you can do that. And if you want to look for things to share on Facebook, you can get it from the Climate Stewards Facebook page as well. So I encourage everybody to use those resources in addition to the Road for Climate Actions to get a little more local flair. One thing that we're resonating with on how to talk to people is, one thing that comes across pretty much, I mean, I honestly can, you've got to find someone who's really stuck in the mud to be able to get them to say that climate change is not happening at this point. I mean, it's just so clear, and it affects everybody so much that it's pretty easy at this point to win an argument whether it's happening or not. The problem, of course, is what do we need to do about it? So as long as we are talking about issues that are, that even Representative Wolfhoffer can get on board with, I mean, there's a lot of common ground that we can work on. And one of the ways that we've certainly discovered is very good to get people talking about it, and an easy way to get out and talk to your neighbors, as you said. The data shows your neighbors are probably on board, so it's good to talk to them. But if they're not, we've certainly, going to get to the parachutes on the planet here, where going around and doing art and things like that to get the conversation going is a wonderful way to get to talk to people and get the ball rolling on those conversations. So I wanted to see how your experience with the parachutes has been, because we're very involved in this. Parachutes with the
Does everybody know what parachutes for the planet is? So do you want to explain it or quickly?
Yeah, basically it's, so Barton Rubenstein is actually we found out a very famous artist in the DC area. And he has basically created a project, it's called Mother Earth Project, which is working on something called Parachute for the Planet. Basically getting different communities, whether it's schools or different villages or towns, to paint these murals that are on a canvas. Actually, some of them are literally retired parachutes, circular parachutes. And they're basically painting their expression of preserving the environment, or environmental stewardship. And those parachutes are actually getting mailed to Barton like every day, and some even coming from Africa. And we actually brought two of them across the country. One which was pre-painted by a high school team. It was a tribute to our Road for Action trip, which was nice. But the other one was a blank parachute, and we've taken it to Native American communities all across the northern leg of our country. And they've been each painting a little piece of the pie about, so it's become an intertribal parachute. And we just dropped it off to Barton, which was really exciting to see sort of the Native American expression collectively in the project now. And what's also great is they're going to be displaying them at various exhibitions. He has about 200 now. They just did one in the National Mall in DC, I think a few months ago.
For the youth.
For 0 hour. Yeah, and it's basically sort of an artistic wake-up call for the environment. Yeah.
This project was started by Callan Benson.
Oh, really?
My daughter. It was Callan's project. So Barton.
Wait, so are you the other co-founder? You said he was a co-founder. So are you guys?
We are, yeah. Callan and I are the co-directors of the project. So it was her project last year that started and then Barton came to us with the idea of he wanted to see if she was interested in taking it internationally. So, and she was on the core team of 0 Hour. So that's.
I should have just had you describe the whole project.
That's okay. That's why people were laughing. It's okay. But
we wanted to get your
yeah.
impressions of climate change and how it varies.
Yeah, I think it's great. Anything that can give us a different way to express our concern for the environment. Sometimes writing a letter to Congress or whoever doesn't. It's sort of the same thing that they see from every other issue, every other advocate. But I think this is something really powerful, and as you know, the sort of inspiration seems to be partly from the AIDS quilts that they did in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. So that's that has a power to sort of tap into people emotionally, right, and get sort of attention on issues. And I think that's one of the useful parts of this Parachute for the Planet thing is that it's something that you don't have to read or think much about. You just see it, and it touches you, and it gets you thinking about the environment, Mother Earth, and preservation, which I think is really powerful. Yes.
I don't know if it was mentioned, but the parachutes, they're all done by kids.
A lot of them, yeah. That's exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a lot of fun meeting the different youth. We actually were able to visit a few different Native American reservations and visit some youth centers, and we went to a powwow, and that was an intertribal powwow, so we just were there and had kids, and there were some adults that painted as well during the powwow. But yeah, it was a really nice experience, and it sparks conversation about what you're doing, and it's also, you just see something different when someone or a child gets down there and starts painting, like the wheels, you see the wheels turning in their own mind, where they're just kind of expressing themselves and have like a freedom that you don't really get to experience when you're just interacting with them, so
yeah,
it was really nice.
Thank you for coming up, you and your daughter with that idea. So
yeah, well, it was primarily her.
I really appreciated your explanation of the 400 million years and putting us in that context. What would really be great if someone would, like yourself or a group of scientists, would rebut NOVA specials that come up from Koch brothers that like to actually help people think exactly the ones that you're arguing with. I don't even watch them, so I wouldn't even know, and I'm not a scientist to rebut them. It'd be an interesting kind of project because that's presented out there as science, but you can see what they're doing. They are trying to make people believe that this is just part of a trend. And so it'd be wonderful if a group of scientists would actually have, and I'm sure PBS would maybe be.
Are they like?
Well, the Koch brothers on them, and that probably says, so it's not overt, but it's all subtle because that's what, when you turn on the TV and you see NOVA come up, you know it's going to be about how there's these big, long, different changes in climate over history.
Right.
And how the Earth is always changing. And so it would be a wonderful project for someone with the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean that's what I try to do with this book too, is basically take all the sort of garbage that we hear that we
That's PBS. And
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
They put that on TV.
well, it's so subtle and it's difficult.
science.
It's science in the way, it is science.
It's
It's
taking
just cherry
advantage
picking.
of people's, yeah, not everybody's a scientist and they're kind of exploiting that, which is not very.
Yeah.
Which program are you
It's
talking
no,
about?
But which notebook?
a lot of the ones that come are, when I turn it on, it seems to be ones about this, it's never about climate change, right? It's always about the history of the climate changes over time, as you discussed. It's never about now.
Just one last thing I'll say here is, just to look back, I mean, when you say parachutes come out from Africa, we're back to the Citizens Climate Lobby. I mean, all those contacts were through Citizens Climate Lobby International to make the contacts with people in Africa to get the parachutes. And I wanted to make sure that Citizens Climate Lobby here has a chance to say what they're doing locally and at least give when you're meeting and if there's anything going on.
Well, there's a number of people, Citizens Climate Lobby here. We meet on the second Saturday of every month at UUCA, the Universalist Unitarian Church in Annapolis. Saturday afternoons, and we have a national call. We're trying to go for lobbying Congress on a national level, specifically for this carbon fee dividend. We're trying to find a way to talk to the people who are the skeptics or don't see it as important, because we need to talk to everyone, not everybody. And yeah, we're bipartisan.
Yeah, I would say that probably one of the most positive things that CCL has done is the role they've played in creating the House Climate Solutions Caucus, which is 88 members strong,
Right.
44 Republicans, 44 Democrats. So we don't know exactly what that caucus is going to come up with, but we know it's bipartisan, and we know they're looking at climate solutions.
Yes.
And we have, I think the CCL has their ear for a carbon fee and dividend.
Yes, absolutely. Join CCL. I do think I'm a huge fan. Yep.
One more thing, since you're talking to your representative, Dana, tomorrow, Congress in 2016 had a climate scientist speak to them, and he was, quote, a climate scientist. He's at the University of Alabama. His name is Dr. John Christie, and he has developed this thing, and this is where a lot of these people, if they're thinking that the science is not unified, he's just one of the ones, he's measuring the temperature at satellite height, not at the Earth. So it's not going to be the same. And he also, would cherry pick data and not give anything after 2015. So a lot of these, maybe that's the last time the Congress had somebody talk to them.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I mean, you have to be careful with any single scientist, to be honest. And in fact, don't trust me only. Look at others, and it turns out I'm actually not an anomaly. There's about 90, as they say, like 97% of scientists are saying what I'm saying. So, as it relates to nutrition or climate change or any other science, health-related thing, I mean, look at the consensus. That's what I always say. And something like this guy looking at satellite temperature. There's all types of individual studies that don't always agree with the consensus, which is why we always have to look at the studies in aggregate and see what they say. And climate change is a very clear message. I know some people are slipping out the door, so I want to say thank you again, and feel free to come up and chat with us.